All right, I'm joined now by David Leyonhjelm, Senator David Leyonhjelm, live from Canberra. Thanks for your company. Let me start by asking you, if I can, to get your reaction to this discussion. It's on the front page of the Financial Review that the Turnbull government is considering quickly changing the voting rules to stop the micro parties, according to this article, gaming the preference system to win Senate seats. What's your reaction to that?
I don't think there's any serious thought being given to getting rid of group voting tickets. I had a chat to Matthias Cormann, the Minister, this morning. He's the Minister responsible for the electoral system. And unless he's the world's best poker player, I don't believe that's on his agenda. Certainly they're looking around for some sort of changes to be made, and there are some changes that I could live with. But getting rid of group voting tickets to wipe out all the minor parties, I don't really think that's on the government's agenda. Wouldn't necessarily be in their interests anyway. They'd end up with the Senate being gridlocked between Labor, the Greens and the government, and Nick Xenophon would survive. Whether that would be better than the current situation is a very moot point.
When you say there's some reform that you can live with, what's the sort of changes that you're talking about?
Well, the proposal that I and most of the crossbench actually have put to the government and said we would be happy with is to adopt the Victorian voting system for the upper house, which is you still have group voting tickets and a one above the line, but if you don't want to follow the preferences that the parties have negotiated between themselves, you can vote below the line, but you only have to vote up to the number of vacancies to be filled. So in a normal half Senate election, you'd vote 1 to 6. If you had a full Senate election in a double dissolution, you'd vote 1 to 12, and then you don't have to go any further if you don't want to. So that's what is the situation in Victoria for their upper house elections, and something like that for the Senate I think would be pretty okay.
One of the issues around the double dissolution election, of course, is the ABCC legislation. I see we've had a media release come through just moments ago from Michaelia Cash. She's holding a media conference there in Parliament House in about 15 minutes from now. It's slated to be on the ABCC issue. A lot of discussion that the government may be serious in their threats of a DD election on this. Senator Zed Zeldra a moment ago, who I spoke to here on Newsday, he said that this is not a bluff by the government. What's your reaction to it all?
No, I don't think it's a bluff. I think it's a realistic possibility. It's certainly not their first choice, and there are complications involved in a double dissolution. When you would call it, when would the budget be brought down? Are they going to also try and change the electoral laws, or stick with the ones they've got if they go to a double dissolution? So it's not as simple as it sounds, but it's not an empty threat. It is a realistic possibility. Up until May, I understand, it could be called.
And what's your view on another policy issue? There's so much in the mix at the moment. The GST, we've been talking a lot about it here on Sky News. It's obviously all through the papers as well. The political class discussing it as well. What's your view on the concept of a government mandate for GST changes based on what they take to an election? There's always been a debate about this between senators and the government in particular, including amongst political scientists in the academy. What is your view that if a government lays out major GST changes in detail ahead of an election and then wins that election in the lower house, arguing the case for them, do you as a senator have some obligation to wave that through or not?
Well, it's not an automatic. It's not an automatic wave through. I mean, if I got elected, or when I was elected, it was on the basis of my party's principles, and every other senator from a non-government party would say the same thing, that they were elected on their party's policies, and so therefore they have a mandate to pursue those as well. I do tend to have a reasonable amount of respect for the government's mandate on big issues like that anyway. It's one of the reasons why I'm not particularly opposed to the ABCC bill. There are aspects about it that I don't like, but I've negotiated with them for a sunset clause in it, and so that satisfies my objections, broadly speaking. And the point I'm making is that the ABCC, they can argue they have a mandate for it. They went to the election with reintroducing it. When I first met Tony Abbott, even before I was sworn in, when he was Prime Minister, he raised the ABCC with me as one of his top priorities. It's been on their agenda for a long time, and you can't just say, oh, well, you know, that's you and I'm different. You do have to take account of that, but it's not an automatic blank check.
Let me ask it, and that's obviously a reasonable position, it's not an automatic blank check, but you know, in the sort of realms, as a last point if I can, in the sort of realms of speculation, if the government finds a way to win the next election, they lose some of their majority but they get over the line and they do argue for detailed tax reform change, it would involve putting the GST up, let's say, but with some tax relief in other areas. You might agree with some of it but not all of it. Is your sense that the crossbench more broadly would have, I guess, a predisposition for honouring the government's mandate, even if there's a little bit of horse trading that has to happen along the way? Or do you think that the upper house would take a different view when it comes to the crossbenchers?
Peter, I'm afraid that the crossbench, if it was a similar situation in the next parliament as it is now, reason and logic and consistency and so forth are fairly unknown concepts. The approach I would take would be undoubtedly different from a number of the other crossbenchers if current experience is anything to go by. And frankly, I find it hard to predict how it might turn out. It tends to be emotional, reactive, reactionary, you know, based on, you know, how am I feeling today type of stuff. I don't find it very constructive at all. My attitude to that kind of scenario where the government goes to an election with a tax policy is to say, okay, well, I'm not going to worry about the detail, that's something you took to the election, but is it going to increase the overall tax burden? It's a fundamental principle of me and my party that we won't support any increase in taxes or the overall tax burden. So if it passed that test, then I would say, well, look, the government took it to an election, I'm inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt. But I really couldn't speak for some of my fellow crossbenchers. I know several of them would agree with me on that one, but there'd be some that I couldn't speak for at all.
And whether it's enough or not will, I guess, depend on what it looks like up there after the next half-Senate election as well. David Leyonhjelm, always appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us once again.
My pleasure.